Liberalism is the belief in freedom and equal rights generally associated with such thinkers as John Locke and Montesquieu. Liberalism as a political movement spans the better part of the last 4 centuries, though the use of the word liberalism to refer to a specific political doctrine did not occur until the 19th century. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England laid the foundations for the development of the modern liberal state by constitutionally limiting the power of the monarch, affirming parliamentary supremacy, passing the Bill of Rights and establishing the principle of consent of the governed. The 1776 Declaration of Independence of the United States of America founded the nascent republic on liberal principles without the encumbrance of hereditary aristocracy. The Declaration stated that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, echoing John Locke's phrase, life, liberty, and property. A few years later, the French Revolution overthrew the hereditary aristocracy with the slogan, liberty, equality, fraternity, and was the first state in history to grant universal male suffrage. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, first codified in 1789 in France, is a foundational document of both liberalism and human rights. The intellectual progress of the Enlightenment, which questioned old traditions about societies and governments, eventually coalesced into powerful revolutionary movements that toppled ancient regimes all over the world, especially in Europe, Latin America, and North America. Liberalism fully exploded as a comprehensive movement against the old order during the French Revolution, which influenced later events on the European continent and around the world. The classical liberalism espoused by Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill and others broadly emphasized the importance of free markets, civil liberties and laissez-faire style governance with a minimum of interference. This approach dominated the liberal tradition during the 19th century. The widening disparity between rich and poor in the late 19th century, especially in England and Germany, began a trend toward social liberalism that emphasized a greater role for the state in ameliorating devastating social conditions. By the beginning of the 21st century, liberal democracies and the fundamental characteristics, support for constitutions, free and fair elections and pluralistic society had prevailed in most regions around the world. Beginnings. English Civil War isolated strands of liberal thought that had existed in Western philosophy since the ancient Greeks, began to coalesce at the time of the English Civil War. Disputes between the Parliament and King Charles I over political supremacy sparked a massive civil war in the 1640s, which culminated in Charles's execution and the establishment of a republic. In particular, the Levellers, a radical political movement of the period, published the Manifesto Agreement of the People, which advocated popular sovereignty and extended voting suffrage, religious tolerance and equality before the law. Many of the liberal concepts of Locke were foreshadowed in the radical ideas that were freely aired at the time. The pamphleteer Richard Doverton wrote, "To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. No man hath power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man's." Algernon Sidney was second only to John Locke in his influence on liberal political thought in 18th century Britain and colonial America, and was widely read and quoted by the Whig opposition during the Glorious Revolution. Sidney's argument that free men always have the right to resist tyrannical government was widely quoted by the patriots at the time. time of American Revolutionary War, and Thomas Jefferson considered Sidney to have been one of the two primary sources for the Founding Fathers' view of liberty. Sidney believed that absolute monarchy was a great political evil, and his major work, Discourses Concerning Government, was written during the Exclusion Crisis, as a response to Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, a defense of divine right monarchy. Sidney firmly rejected the Filmer's reactionary principles and argued that the subjects of the monarch were entitled by right to share in the government through advice and counsel. Liberal philosophy. These ideas were first drawn together and systematized as a distinct ideology by the English philosopher John Locke, generally regarded as the father of modern liberalism. Thomas Hobbes had developed the concept of the social contract, according to which individuals in the anarchic and brutal state of nature came together and voluntarily ceded some of their individual rights to an established state authority, which would create laws to regulate social interactions. Whereas Hobbes advocated a strong monarchical authority, Locke developed the then radical notion that government acquires consent from the governed, which has to be constantly present for the government to remain legitimate. His influential two treatises, the foundational text of liberal ideology, outlined his major ideas. Once humans moved out of the natural state and formed societies, Locke argued as follows: thus, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of freemen capable of a majority to unite and incorporate into such a society. And this is that, and that only, which did give beginning to any lawful government in the world. The stringent insistence that lawful government did not have a supernatural basis was a sharp break with the dominant theories of governance, which advocated the divine right of kings, and echoed the earlier thought of Aristotle. One political scientist described this new thinking as follows: in the liberal understanding, there are no citizens within the regime who can claim to rule by natural or supernatural right, without the consent of the governed. Locke had other intellectual opponents besides Hobbes. In the first treatise, Locke aimed his guns first and foremost at one of the doyens of 17th-century English conservative philosophy, Robert Filmer. Filmer's Patriarcha argued for the divine right of kings by appealing to biblical teaching, claiming that the authority granted to Adam by God gave successors of Adam in the male line of descent a right of dominion over all other humans and creatures in the world. Locke disagreed so thoroughly and obsessively with Filmer, however, that the first treatise is almost a sentence-by-sentence refutation of Patriarcha. Reinforcing his respect for consensus, Locke argued that conjugal society is made up by a voluntary compact between men and women. Locke maintained that the grant of dominion in Genesis was not to men over women, as Filmer believed, but to humans over animals. Locke was certainly no feminist by modern standards, but the first major liberal thinker in history accomplished an equally major task on the road to making the world more pluralistic: the integration of women into social theory. Locke also originated the concept of the separation of church and state. Based on the social contract principle, Locke argued that the government lacked authority in the realm of individual conscience, as this was something rational people could not cede to the government for it or others to control. For Locke, this created a natural right in the liberty of conscience, which he argued must therefore remain protected from any government authority. He also formulated a general defense for religious toleration in his letters concerning toleration. Three arguments are central: earthly judges, the state in particular, and human beings generally, cannot dependably evaluate the truth claims of competing religious standpoints, even if they could. Enforcing a single, true religion would not have the desired effect, because belief cannot be compelled by violence. Coercing religious uniformity would lead to more social disorder than allowing diversity. Locke was also influenced by the liberal ideas of Presbyterian politician and poet John Milton, who was a staunch advocate of freedom in all its forms. Milton argued for disestablishment as the only effective way of achieving broad toleration. Rather than force a man's conscience, government should recognize the persuasive force of the gospel. As assistant to Oliver Cromwell, Milton also took part in drafting a constitution of the independence that strongly stressed the equality of all humans as a consequence of democratic tendencies. In his Areopagitica, Milton provided one of the first arguments for the importance of freedom of speech, the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties. His central argument was that the individual is capable of using reason to distinguish right from wrong. To be able to exercise this right, everyone must have unlimited access to the ideas of his fellow men in a free and open encounter, and this will allow the good arguments to prevail. Glorious Revolution. The impact of these ideas steadily increased during the 17th century in England, culminating in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which enshrined parliamentary sovereignty and the right of revolution, and led to the establishment of what many consider the first modern, liberal state. Significant legislative milestones in this period included the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, which strengthened the convention that forbade detention lacking sufficient cause or evidence. The Bill of Rights formally established the supremacy of the law and of Parliament over the monarch and laid down basic rights for all Englishmen. The bill made royal interference with the law and with elections to Parliament illegal, made the agreement of Parliament necessarily for the implementation of any new taxes, and outlawed the maintenance of a standing army during peacetime, without Parliament's consent. The right to petition the monarch was granted to everyone, and cruel and unusual punishments were made illegal under all circumstances. This was followed a year later with the Act of Toleration, which drew its ideological content from John Locke's 4 letters advocating religious toleration. The Act allowed freedom of worship to nonconformists who pledged oaths of allegiance and supremacy to the Anglican Church. The Act, however, did not apply to Catholics and non-Trinitarians, who remained excluded from political office. The Licensing of the Press Act 1662, which sanctioned government censorship of the printing press, expired in 1692 at the end of the existing session of Parliament. In 1695 the Commons refused to renew the legislation, leading to a continuous period of unprecedented freedom of the press. Era of Enlightenment. The development of liberalism continued throughout the 18th century with the burgeoning Enlightenment ideals of the era. This was a period of profound intellectual vitality that questioned old traditions and influenced several European monarchies throughout the 18th century. A prominent example of a monarch who took the Enlightenment project seriously was Joseph II of Austria, who ruled from 1780 to 1790 and implemented a wide array of radical reforms, such as the complete abolition of serfdom, the imposition of equal taxation policies between the aristocracy and the peasantry, the institution of religious toleration, including equal civil rights for Jews, and the suppression of Catholic religious authority throughout his empire, creating a more secular nation. Besides the Enlightenment, A rising tide of industrialization and urbanization in Western Europe during the 18th century also contributed to the growth of liberal society by spurring commercial and entrepreneurial activity. In the early 18th century, the Commonwealth men and the Country Party in England promoted republicanism and condemned the perceived widespread corruption and lack of morality during the Walpole era, theorizing that only civic virtue could protect a country from despotism and ruin. A series of essays, known as Cato's Letters, published in the London Journal during the 1720s and written by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, condemned tyranny and advanced principles of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. They were an important influence on the development of republicanism in the United States. In the 1760s, the Middlesex Radicals, led by the politician John Wilkes, who was expelled from the House of Commons for seditious libel, founded the Society for the Defense of the Bill of Rights and developed the belief that every man had the right to vote, and natural reason enabled him to properly judge political issues. Liberty consisted in frequent elections. This was to begin a long tradition of British radicalism. French Enlightenment in contrast to England. The French experience in the 18th century was characterized by the perpetuation of feudalism and absolutism. Ideas that challenged the status quo were often harshly repressed. Most of the philosophers of the French Enlightenment were progressive in the liberal sense and advocated the reform of the French system of government along more constitutional and liberal lines. Baron de Montesquieu wrote a series of highly influential works in the early 18th century, including Persian Letters and The Spirit of the Laws. The latter exerted tremendous influence both inside and outside France. Montesquieu pleaded in favor of a constitutional system of government, the preservation of civil liberties and the law, and the idea that political institutions ought to reflect the social and geographical aspects of each community. In particular, he argued that political liberty required the separation of the powers of government. Building on John Locke's second treatise of government, he advocated that the executive, legislative, and judicial functions of government should be assigned to different bodies, so that attempts by one branch of government to infringe on political liberty might be restrained by the other branches. In a lengthy discussion of the English political system, which he greatly admired, he tried to show how this might be achieved and liberty secured, even in a monarchy. He also notes that liberty cannot be secure where there is no separation of powers, even in a republic. He also emphasized the importance of a robust due process in law, including the right to a fair trial, the presumption of innocence and proportionality in the severity of punishment. Another important figure of the French Enlightenment was Voltaire. Initially believing in the constructive role an enlightened monarch could play in improving the welfare of the people, he eventually came to a new conclusion: it is up to us to cultivate our garden. His most polemical and ferocious attacks on intolerance and religious persecutions indeed began to appear a few years later. Despite much persecution, Voltaire remained a courageous polemicist who indefatigably fought for civil rights, the right to a fair trial and freedom of religion, and who denounced the hypocrisies and injustices of the ancient regime. Era of Revolution. American Revolution. Tensions between the British and the American colonies grew after the 7 Years' War over the issue of taxation without representation, culminating in the latter's decision to declare independence and face the consequences. The intellectual underpinnings for independence were provided by the English pamphleteer Thomas Paine. His Common Sense Pro-Independence pamphlet was anonymously published on January 10, 1776 and became an immediate success. It was read aloud everywhere, including the army. He pioneered a style of political writing that was able to render complex ideas intelligible to average patriot. The Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson, echoed Locke convincingly. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. After the war, Americans debated about how to move forward. The first attempt at cooperation transpired under the Articles of Confederation, which were eventually regarded as too inadequate to provide security, or even a functional government. The new nation held a constitutional convention in 1787 to resolve the problems stemming from the Articles of Confederation. The resulting Constitution of the United States was a monumental document in American history and in world history as well. In the context of the times, the Constitution was a revolutionary and liberal document. It encoded the principles of republicanism in the United States, stressing virtues, civic duty, rejection of royalty and aristocracy, and checks and balances against corruption of the sort that patriots detested in the British system. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, known as the United States Bill of Rights, guaranteed some of the natural rights liberal thinkers used to justify the revolution. The American theorists and politicians strongly believe in the sovereignty of the people rather than in the sovereignty of the king. As one historian writes, the American adoption of a democratic theory that all governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, as it had been put as early as the Declaration of Independence, was epoch-marking. The American Revolution had its impact on the French Revolution and later movements in Europe. Leopold von Ranke, a leading German historian, in 1848 argued that American republicanism played a crucial role in the development of European liberalism. By abandoning English constitutionalism and creating a new republic based on the rights of the individual, the North Americans introduced a new force in the world. Ideas spread most rapidly when they have found adequate concrete expression. Thus republicanism entered a Romanic, Germanic world. Up to this point, the conviction had prevailed in Europe that monarchy best served the interests of the nation. Now the idea spread that the nation should govern itself, but only after a state had actually been formed. On the basis of the theory of representation did the full significance of this idea become clear. All later revolutionary movements have this same goal. This was the complete reversal of a principle. Until then, a king who ruled by the grace of God had been the center around which everything turned. Now the idea emerged that power should come from below. These two principles are like two opposite poles, and it is the conflict between them that determines the course of the modern world. In Europe, the conflict between them had not yet taken on concrete form. With the French Revolution it did. French Revolution. 3 years into the French Revolution, German writer Johann von Goethe reportedly told the defeated Prussian soldiers after the Battle of Valmy that, from this place and from this time forth commences a new era in world history, and you can all say that you were present at its birth. Historians widely regard the Revolution as one of the most important events in human history. The Revolution is often seen as marking the dawn of the modern era, and its convulsions are widely associated with the triumph of liberalism. Describing the participatory politics of the French Revolution, one historian commented that thousands of men and even many women gained first-hand experience in the political arena. They talked, read, and listened in new ways. They voted, they joined new organizations, and they marched for the political goals. Revolution became a tradition, and republicanism an enduring option. For liberals, the Revolution was the defining moment, and later liberals approved of the French Revolution almost entirely, not only its results but the act itself, as two historians noted. A key event of the Revolution came in 1789 with the passage of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Jefferson, the American ambassador to France, was consulted in its drafting, and there are striking similarities with the American Declaration of Independence. The next few years were dominated by tensions between various liberal assemblies and a conservative monarchy intent on thwarting major reforms. A republic was proclaimed in September 1792, and King Louis XVI was executed the following year. However, conflict between rival political factions, the Girondins and the Jacobins, culminated in the Reign of Terror, that was marked by mass executions of enemies of the Revolution, with the death toll reaching into the tens of thousands. Finally, Napoleon came to power in 1799, ended any form of democracy with his dictatorship, ended internal civil wars, made peace with the Catholic Church, and conquered much of Europe until he went too far and was finally defeated in 1815. During the Napoleonic Wars, the French brought to Western Europe the liquidation of the feudal system, the liberalization of property laws, the end of seigneurial dues, the abolition of guilds, the legalization of divorce, the disintegration of Jewish ghettos, the collapse of the Inquisition, the final end of the Holy Roman Empire, the elimination of church courts and religious authority, the establishment of the metric system, and equality under the law for all men. Napoleon wrote that the peoples of Germany, as of France, Italy and Spain, want equality and liberal ideas, with some historians suggesting that he may have been the first person ever to use the word liberal in a political sense. He also governed through a method that one historian described as civilian dictatorship, which drew its legitimacy from direct consultation with the people, in the form of a plebiscite. Napoleon did not always live up the liberal ideals he espoused. However, the long-term liberal impact of the French Revolution on Switzerland has been assessed by Martin. It proclaimed the equality of citizens before the law, equality of languages, freedom of thought and faith. It created a Swiss citizenship, basis of our modern nationality, and the separation of powers, of which the old regime had no conception. It suppressed internal tariffs and other economic restraints. It unified weights and measures, reformed civil and penal law, authorized mixed marriages, suppressed torture and improved justice. It developed education and public works. His most lasting achievement, the Civil Code, served as an object of emulation all over the globe, but it also perpetuated further discrimination against women under the banner of the natural order. This unprecedented period of chaos and revolution had irreversibly introduced the world to a new movement and ideology that would soon crisscross the globe. For France, however, the defeat of Napoleon brought about the restoration of the monarchy, and an ultra-conservative order was reimposed on the country.